The Death of the West: How Dying Populations and Immigrant Invasions Imperil Our Country and Civilization by Patrick J. Buchanan. Chapter 2: Where Have All the Children Gone? And ye shall be left few in numbers, whereas ye were as the stars of heaven for multitude, because thou wouldest not obey the voice of the Lord thy God. Deuteronomy 28:28, Holy Bible, King James Version. Why have Europe's nations and peoples stopped having babies and begun to accept their disappearance from this earth with such seeming indifference? Did the wounds of wars or the loss of empire kill the will to live? From the evidence, neither appears to be the case. The Great War left Imperial Germany defeated and dismembered, with 2 million dead and millions crippled. Yet the German population grew so quickly after 1919 that France, which had been among the victors, was alarmed. After World War II, baby booms exploded among the vanquished Japanese and Germans, as well as the victorious Americans. From studying the birth charts, we find that something happened in the mid-1960s, in the midst of the post-war prosperity, that changed the hearts and minds of Western women and killed in them the desire to live as their mothers had. But if the reason Western women stopped having babies remains in dispute, how they did so is not. Contraception halted the population growth of the West, with abortion as the second line of defense against the unwanted child. First, a little history. Only once had the U.S. birth rate fallen below population replacement, during the Depression, when the economy shrank by half and a fourth of America's breadwinners were out of work, many of them out on the streets. Pessimism, a sense of despair that the good times are over and may never come again, can apparently impact national fertility. The silent generation was born in the 1930s, a relatively small cohort and the only generation of the 20th century never to have produced a president. The post-war baby boom began in 1946, peaked in 1957, and fizzled out in 1964. But just as the World War II generation was about done having babies, and the baby boomers themselves were about to begin, a new and more convenient way to prevent pregnancies was discovered. Historians may one day call the pill the suicide tablet of the West. It was first licensed in 1960. By 1963, 6% of American married women were using Dr. Rock's invention. By 1970, 43% were on the pill. As Catholics furiously debated the morality of contraception, and Pope Paul VI issued his encyclical Humanae Vitae, which declared all artificial birth control to be immoral for Catholics, the pill included, suddenly a graver issue arose. Arizona TV personality Sherry Finkbein, a married mother of 4 who had taken thalidomide, the drug that had caused deformities in babies in Europe, learned that she was pregnant. Mrs. Finkbein did not want a deformed child and confided to friends that she desired an abortion. When the news leaked out, Mrs. Finkbein was subjected to threats from some and offers from others to raise the child if only she would carry it to term. As abortion was still against the law, a blazing national debate ensued. But Mrs. Finkbein mooted the issue by flying to Sweden and having the child aborted. In 1966, however, the Finkbein affair was ancient history, for 6,000 abortions were being done every year. By 1970, that figure had leapt to 200,000, as Governors Rockefeller of New York and Reagan of California signed the most liberal abortion laws in America. By 1973, 600,000 abortions were being done. That year, the Supreme Court, with 3 of President Nixon's 4 nominees concurring, declared that a woman's right to an abortion was protected by the Constitution. Within a decade, the number of abortions had soared to 1.5 million a year. And abortions had replaced tonsillectomies as the most common surgical procedure in America. Since Justice Blackmun's decision, 40 million abortions have been performed in the United States. 30% of all pregnancies now end on a tabletop in an abortionist's clinic. In 2000, the Food and Drug Administration approved RU-486, a do-it-yourself abortion drug for use in the first 7 weeks of pregnancy. As no U.S. firm wished to be associated with RU-486, a China-based company began quietly to produce the drug. Cynics might characterize China's role in producing RU-486 for America as an act of assisted suicide for the one nation blocking Beijing's path to Asian hegemony and world power. Roe v. Wade put a constitutional canopy over a woman's right to an abortion. Yet that decision does not of itself explain the sea change in the attitudes of American and Western women. What was it that made them so hostile to the idea of pregnancy and motherhood that they would prefer to have an abortion, an act their own grandparents would have considered a monstrous offense against God and man? In the 1950s, abortion was not only a crime, but a shameful act. There was no national clamor for its legalization. Yet, 15 years later, a Supreme Court decision declaring abortion a constitutional right was hailed as a milestone of social progress. A revolutionary transformation had taken place in the beliefs of tens of millions of Americans. One of two things had happened. Either the 60s drove a moral wedge between us, or the 60s exposed a moral fracture that had existed, but that we had failed to recognize. I believe the former is true. In that pivotal decade of the last century, a large slice of young America was converted to a new way of thinking, believing, and living. From 1945 to 1965, America passed through what sociologists call the golden age of marriage, when the average age of first marriages fell to record lows for both men and women, and the proportion of adults who were married reached an astronomical 95%. The America of Eisenhower and John F. Kennedy was a vibrant, dynamic nation. But, as Alan Carson, president of the Howard Center for Family, Religion, and Society, writes, all the indicators of family well-being abruptly turned in these places, Western nations, during the short 1963 to 1965 period. Fertility resumed its fall, tumbling well below zero growth levels. A massive retreat from marriage commenced, and Western societies seemed to lose all sense of inherited family order. Dutch demographer Dirk van de Ka traces the phenomenon to four transformations. A. A shift from the golden age of marriage to the dawn of a new age of cohabitation. B. A shift from a time of king-child with parents to that of king-parents with one child. C. A shift from preventive contraception to benefit early children to self-fulfilling contraception to benefit parents. D. A shift from a uniform family system to a pluralistic system of families and households, including single-parent families. As the drop-off in the birth rate began in the mid-1960s, this is the site to excavate, to discover the causes of this tectonic shift in attitude of American and Western women away from having children. What ideas did the boomers bring to maturity? What ideas did they absorb in college? The boomers arrived on campus in the fall of 1964. They were the first American generation with the freedom and the means to choose how they wanted to live their lives. In the 1930s, college had been a privilege only a few could afford. Family decisions were imposed by family hardships. If the breadwinner lost his job, sons and daughters could forget about college. They had to quit school and find work. Tens of millions still lived in small towns in rural America, where the Depression had hit the farms long before the 1929 crash hit Wall Street. After Pearl Harbor, the war and war economy made the career decisions for America's young. The silent generation of the 50s grew up with parents, teachers, and clergy still as authority figures. Not until 1957 did Professor Galbraith discover that we were all living in the affluent society. But the parents who had gone through the Depression and the war were determined that my kid's not going to have it as rough as I did. So the baby boomers were raised differently, spending almost as many hours in front of a television as in school. By the mid-1950s, parents had a serious rival for their children's attention, and youngsters had an entertaining and witty ally, and a privileged sanctuary to retreat to, in the age-old struggle against parents. The message that came from TV, especially the ads, was instant gratification. By 1964, the year of Mario Savio and the free speech movement at Berkeley, when the first wave of boomers hit the campuses, never having known hardship or war, it was ready to rock. And though the student riots and rebellions were blamed on LBJ, Nixon, Agnew, and Vietnam, this will not do. For student rebellions were not confined to America. They broke out across Europe and even in Japan. As the 1968 Days of Rage tore apart the Democratic Party in the streets of Chicago, Czech students who made the Prague Spring were facing Russian tanks. Mexican students were being shot down in the streets of the capital, and French students almost seized Paris from President de Gaulle. What baby boomers had in common with contemporaries abroad was not Vietnam, but their numbers, affluence, security, and freedom, and the televised example of their peers all over the world. In childhood, they had all had the same babysitter, TV. A babysitter more entertaining than the parents. Its incessant ad message was the same. Kids, you need this, now! With millions of young women liberated from parents, teachers, and preachers, with money to burn, and with the in-loco parentis authority of dons and deans crumbling, the revolutions rolled over the campuses. The anti-war movement, hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? And ho, 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 Chi Minh, the NLF is going to win. The drug revolution, turn on, tune in, drop out. And the sexual revolution, make love, not war. Then came the women's movement. Modeled on the civil rights movement, it won converts even in Middle America. As blacks had demanded equal rights with whites, women demanded the same rights as men, nothing less than full equality. If the boys can sow their wild oats in frat houses and singles bars and with one-night stands, why not us? But as nature did not design the sexes that way, and the consequences of promiscuity are unequally borne by women, in the form of babies, solutions had to be found. The magic of the marketplace did the rest. If you forgot to take the pill or the contraceptive didn't work, the local abortionist would not fail. The old sanctions against promiscuity collapsed. Nature's sanctions, unwanted pregnancy and fear of disease, were taken care of by the pill, available abortion, and the new miracle drugs. No need for shotgun marriages. One teary-eyed trip to the Center for Reproductive Rights gets the job done. The fear of social stigma, loss of reputation, was lifted by a popular culture that celebrated the sexual revolution and applauded as swingers girls who in the 1940s and 1950s might have been called less attractive names. The moral sanctions, the sense of shame and sin, of violating God's law, of risking one's immortal soul, were eased by a new breed of Are You Running With Me, Jesus priests and pastors, who won huge popularity by explaining that he, or she, was just not that kind of judgmental God, and hey, hell is only a metaphor. Not only did the old sanctions collapse, a new way of measuring morality emerged to justify and even to sanctify doing one's own thing. Under the new code, morality was now to be determined not by who slept with whom or who inhaled what, trivial matters of personal preference, but by who went south for civil rights, who protested apartheid, who had marched against the dirty, immoral war in Vietnam. As has often been true in history, a new moral code was crafted to justify the new lifestyle already adopted. As they indulged themselves in sex, drugs, riots, and rock and roll, the young Jacobins had the reassurance of their indulgent and pandering elders that, yes, indeed, this is the finest young generation we have ever produced. Has it not ever been so with revolutions? Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young, very heaven, burbled the great Wordsworth of an earlier revolution that turned out rather badly. In the 1960s, both a student rebellion and a cultural revolution rolled over the campuses. When the rebels graduated, got jobs, and got married, they ceased to be rebels, taking their place in the country of their parents and voting for Ronald Reagan. Though it took some, our president comes to mind, perhaps longer than others, to break away. The 60s rebels, however, were not the revolutionaries. Converts to the revolution came to college thinking and believing one way, and left thinking and believing an entirely different way that changed their whole lives. Hillary Rodham, the Goldwater girl who came to Wellesley in 1965 and left as a social radical in 1969, with new values, a new moral code, and a steely resolve to change the corrupt society in which she had been raised, is as good an example of the revolutionary as Mr. Bush is of the rebel. The cultural revolution that swept America's campuses was a true revolution. In a third of a century, the Judeo-Christian moral order it defied has been rejected by millions. Its hostility to Aussie and Harriet America has been internalized by our cultural elites, and through their domination of our opinion and value-shaping institutions, film, TV, the theater, magazines, music, these evangelists of revolution have spread their gospel all over the world and converted scores of millions. We are two Americas. Mother Angelica in the Sunday sermon compete with Ally McBeal in Sex and the City. And the message the dominant culture emits, day and night, reacts with mocking laughter to the old idea that the good life for a woman means a husband and a house full of kids. And there are now powerful collateral forces in society that are also pulling American women away from the maternity ward forever. A. The new economy. In an agricultural economy, the workplace was the home, where husband and wife labored together and lived together. In the industrial economy, the man left the home to work in a factory, while his wife stayed home to look after the children. The agricultural economy gave us the extended family. The industrial economy, the nuclear family. But in the post-industrial economy, husband and wife both work at the office, and no one stays home with the children. Indeed, there may be no children. As political science professor James Kurth of Swarthmore writes, the greatest movement of the second half of the 19th century was the movement of men from farm to the factory. The greatest movement of the second half of the 20th century has been the movement of women from the home to the office. This movement separates the parents from the children, as well as enabling the wife to separate herself from her husband. By splitting the nuclear family, it is helping to bring about the replacement of the nuclear family with the non-family. As men's jobs in manufacturing, mining, farming, and fishing are no longer needed or are shipped overseas, the skills and talents of women are now more desirable. There are also opportunities in government, education, and the professions open to women today that their mothers and grandmothers never had. Businesses, large and small, offer packages of pay and benefits to lure talented women out of the home and keep them out of the maternity ward, where they are no good to the company. It is working. In the scores of millions, American women have left the home for the office to work beside and compete with men. By the tens of millions, women college graduates have put off marriage, many forever. You can have it all, the modern woman is told, baby and a career. With nannies, courtesy of open borders, with equal pay for equal work, maternity leave, and daycare, courtesy of government and the company, the lure is not a lie. What you can't have is a brood of kids back home while keeping pace with the competition at the office. Forced to choose, women are choosing career, or career and the joy of motherhood once. The global economy works hand in hand with the new economy, transferring manufacturing jobs from high-wage Western nations to the low-wage, newly industrialized nations of Asia and Latin America. With working America's yellow brick road to the middle class down to one lane, wives must work to keep up with the Joneses next door. So children are put off, sometimes for good. In 1950, 88% of women with children under 6 stayed home, where they often had more kids. Today, 64% of American women with children under 6 are in the labor force. How are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris? Was said of the World War I soldiers who went off to Europe. Well, how are you going to get them back in the burbs after they've seen DC? One might ask of the talented women lawyers, journalists, PR specialists, and political aides who have enjoyed the great game in an exciting city. Writing in The Spectator, Eleanor Mills is an authentic voice of her generation. The fact is that girls like me, i.e., healthy, hearty, middle class women in their 20s, are just not breeding. Why not? Because, she writes, my generation's twin preoccupations are, unfortunately, looks and money. She quotes one of her many childless contemporaries. If I had a kid, said Jane, an advertising executive, thoughtfully, I wouldn't be able to do half the things I take for granted. Every Saturday at 10:30 a.m., when we are still in bed, my husband and I look at each other and just say, thank God we weren't up at 5 a.m. caring for a brat. We have such a great time, just the two of us. Who knows if it would work if we introduced another person into the equation? The rich are different from us, said F. Scott Fitzgerald. To which Hemingway replied, yes, they have more money. But the rich also have fewer children. Using Occam's razor, the simplest explanation is usually the right one. The best explanation for the sinking birth rate in the West may be the simplest. As America's poor enter the middle class, and the middle class becomes affluent, and the affluent become rich, each adopts the style of the class they have lately entered. All begin to downsize their families. All begin to have fewer children. A corollary follows. The richer a nation becomes, the fewer its children, and the sooner it begins to die. Societies organized to ensure the maximum pleasure, freedom, and happiness for all their members are, at the same time, advancing the date of their own funerals. Fate may compensate the Chinese, Islamic, and Latin peoples for their hardships and poverty in this century, with the domination of the earth in the next. Indeed, do we not have it on high authority that blessed are the meek, they shall inherit the earth? B. End of the family wage. In the 1830s, as America's Industrial Revolution was about to begin, the Philadelphia Trade Union warned its members about the hidden agenda of what it called cormorant capital. Oppose employment of our women folks with all your minds and with all your strength, for it will prove our ruin. We must strive to obtain sufficient remuneration for our labor, to keep the wives and daughters and sisters of our people at home. That cormorant capital will have every man, woman, and child to toil, but let us exert our families to oppose its designs. In 1848, the year of Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto, the labor publication 10-Hour Advocate editorialized, we hope the day is not distant when the husband will be able to provide for his wife and family without sending the wife to endure the drudgery of a cotton mill. This vision of American free labor was at war with the view being espoused by Marx and his patron and collaborator Frederick Engels, who wrote in The Origin of the Family, Private Property in the State, the first condition for the liberation of the wife is to bring the whole female sex into public industry, and this in turn demands the abolition of the monogamous family as the economic unit of society. Is it not a remarkable coincidence how global capitalism's view of women as units of production, liberated from husbands, home, and family, conforms so precisely to the view of the fathers of global communism? As Alan Carlson, who also publishes The Family in America, writes, there was a consensus in America, not so long ago, that employers should pay fathers a family wage, sufficient to support their wives and children in dignity, without their having to leave the home to go to work. That was considered one of the defining characteristics of a good society. The idea is enshrined in Pope Leo XIII's 1891 encyclical Rerum Novarum. In books such as A Living Wage, Catholic social critic Father John Ryan championed the idea and stressed the need to moralize the wage contract to protect the home. The state has both the right and the duty to compel all employers to pay a living wage, wrote Father Ryan. This idea was widely accepted. Carlson notes that the wage gap between men and women actually widened after World War II. In 1939, women earned 59.3% of men's pay. By 1966, that had fallen to 53.6%. In the 1940s and 1950s, the culture, with a good conscience, separated men and women in the workplace. In newspapers, the men wanted ads were run separate from the women wanted ads. Only rarely could working women be found outside such occupations as clerk typist, secretary, nurse, school teacher, or salesgirl. Carlson writes, to an observer from the year 2000, the most amazing thing about this system was that it was both understood by the average people and popularly supported. In opinion polls, large majorities of Americans, 85% or more, women and men, agreed that fathers deserved an income that would support their wives and children at home, and that the labor of mothers was secondary or supplemental. This was seen as simple justice. This system fell apart in the 1960s, when feminists managed to add sex to the discriminations forbidden by the sweeping Civil Rights Act of 1964, which had been written to protect the rights of African Americans. This turned the new Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EEOC, into a siege gun against the family wage. Men wanted ads were declared discriminatory and outlawed. Gender equality replaced moral contract. The rights of individuals took precedence over the requirements of family. Women's pay soared, and as women began moving into occupations that had been largely restricted to men, medicine, law, the media, the academy, the upper bureaucracy, and business, families began to crumble. Between 1973 and 1996, writes Dr. Carlson, the real median income of men, aged 15 and above, working full-time, fell 24%, from $37,200 to $30,000. Marching under feminist banners, equal pay for equal work, and equal pay for comparable work, women moved into direct competition with men. Millions succeeded, shouldering men aside with superior performance. Their pay rose steadily, and the absolute and relative pay of married men stagnated or fell. With their families under pressure, married men began to yield to wives' insistence that they go back to work. Young men found they no longer earned enough in their late teens or early 20s to start a family, even if that had been their hope and dream. Stripped of the duties of fatherhood and family, Many of these young men wound up in trouble and even in prison. America's young women found they could achieve independence on their own. They need not get married, certainly not yet. More and more did not marry. In 1970, only 36% of women aged 20 to 24 were unmarried. By 1995, 68% were in the never married category. Among women 25 to 29, the never marrieds had soared from 10% to 35%. The young family with a batch of kids is now an endangered species. Only the young rich can afford that lifestyle, and they are uninterested. With the Democratic Party so beholden to feminism that it cannot even oppose partial birth abortions, and the GOP enthralled to libertarian ideology and controlled by corporate interests, the call of the gods of the marketplace for more women workers prevails over the command of the God of Genesis: be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth. Many conservatives have succumbed to the heresy of economism, a mere Marxism that holds that man is an economic animal, that free trade and free markets are the path to peace, prosperity, and happiness. And if we can only get the marginal tax rates right and the capital gains tax abolished, paradise, Dow 36,000, is at hand. But when the income tax rate for the wealthiest was above 90% in the 1950s, America, by every moral and social indicator, was a better country. The Reformed radical and Christian convert Orestes Brownson saw this new idolatry of mammon worship rising in the America of the 19th century. Mammonism has become the religion of Saxondom, and God is not in all our thoughts. We have lost our faith in the noble, the beautiful, and the just. A century later, another convert from a failed materialistic faith would remind us again. Wrote Whittaker Chambers, "Economics is not the central problem of our age. Faith is." C. The population bomb hysteria. Then there was the anti-people movement of the 1960s and 1970s, the elite's backlash against the baby boom. Paul Ehrlich, a Stanford University biologist, was its guru, and his bestseller, The Population Bomb, did for population control what Rachel Carson's Silent Spring had done for environmentalism. Ehrlich was a 20th century reincarnation of Thomas Robert Malthus, the British demographer whose prediction of world starvation proved so spectacularly wrong in the 19th century. Malthus had written, "It may be safely asserted that population, when unchecked, increases in geometrical progression of such a nature as to double itself every 25 years. As the world's food production could not double every 25 years, said the gloomy parson, mass starvation was dead ahead." Malthus proved as wrong about food production as Ehrlich did about the world's resources, which he assured us were running out. Today, the 6 billion on Earth live in far greater freedom and prosperity than did the 3 billion in 1960, the 2 billion in 1927, or the 1 billion in 1830. Political incompetence and criminality, foolish ideas and insane ideologies are the causes of starvation and misery, not people. Published by the Sierra Club, Ehrlich's book became required reading in many high schools. By 1977, former Secretary of Defense and World Bank President Robert McNamara was playing Henny Penny to Ehrlich's Chicken Little, warning that continued population growth would cause poverty, hunger, stress, crowding, and frustration that would threaten social, economic, and military stability. In 1978, a Congressional Select Committee on Population announced that the major biological systems that humanity depends upon are being strained by rapid population growth, and in some cases, they are losing productive capacity. As Jacqueline Kaysen, author of The War Against Population, writes, about this time the Smithsonian Institution created a traveling exhibit for school children called Population, The Problem Is Us, that featured a picture of a dead rat on a dinner plate as an example of future food sources. As a result of this anti-population propaganda from America's elite institutions of politics and ideas, the public funding for population control here and abroad exploded. But though the message was taken to heart by the First World wealthy and middle class, it was largely ignored by the Third World poor, at whom it had been targeted. We can see the results today: a birth dearth among the affluent nations, and baby booms across the Third World. D. Feminism. To be pro-choice on abortion is today almost a defining mark of the modern woman. To many feminists, the phrase women's liberation means liberation from the traditional, and, in their view, narrow and constricting roles of wife, mother, and homemaker. But among the founding mothers of feminism, it was not always so. Writing on the Supreme Court's Roe v. Wade decision in the New Oxford Review, Catholic columnist Joseph Collison observed, early feminists had been fiercely anti-abortion. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, organizer of the first Women's Rights Convention in 1848, called abortion a disgusting and degrading crime. And Susan B. Anthony, early crusader for the women's vote, wrote that no matter what the motive, the woman is awfully guilty who commits the deed. It will burden her conscience in life. It will burden her soul in death. It was, in fact, the 19th century feminists who campaigned to pass the laws that criminalized abortion. Collison adds that in early editions of the Feminist Mystique, Betty Friedan's seminal work, abortion went unmentioned. It was not a feminist issue in the early 1960s. Back before World War II, when Margaret Sanger, birth mother of Planned Parenthood, wrote that the most merciful thing a large family can do to one of its infant members is to kill it. She was a radical socialist far outside the American mainstream. But the Sanger animus against big families has since become a central feature of the new American feminism that was mainstreamed in the 1960s and 1970s. Today, the perception that marriage is human bondage has become a hallmark of movement militants. Marriage, writes Andrea Dworkin in Pornography, Men Possessing Women, is an institution that developed from rape as a practice. Rape, originally defined as abduction, became marriage by capture. Marriage meant the taking was to extend in time, to be not only use but possession of ownership. Pure Marx. And a logical conclusion follows. The nuclear family must be destroyed, said the feminist Linda Gordon. Families have supported oppression by separating people into small, isolated units, unable to join together to fight for common interests. In 1970, Robin Morgan, now the nanny of Gloria Steinem's love child, Ms. Magazine, called marriage a slavery-like practice, We can't destroy the inequities between men and women until we destroy marriage. That same year, Ms. Morgan edited Sisterhood is Powerful, containing an essay by Valerie Solanas, president of the Society for Cutting Up Men. It is now technically possible to reproduce without the aid of males, and to produce only females, wrote Ms. Solanas. We must begin immediately to do so. The male is a biological accident. The male has made the world a shit pile. Not a lady to be trifled with, Ms. Solanas established her bona fides by going out and shooting Andy Warhol. By late 1973, Nancy Lehman and Helen Sullinger had circulated a new manifesto of the movement they titled Declaration of Feminism, which was broadly reproduced and widely praised. Marriage has existed for the benefit of men and has been a legally sanctioned method of control over women. We must work to destroy it. The end of the institution of marriage is a necessary condition for the liberation of women. Therefore, it is important for us to encourage women to leave their husbands and not to live individually with men. All of history must be rewritten in terms of oppression of women. We must go back to ancient female religions like witchcraft. Among feminists, the slavery simile competes with the prostitution metaphor. Being a housewife is an illegitimate profession, wrote Vivian Gornick, Penn State professor and author in 1980. The choice to serve and be protected and plan toward being a family member is a choice that shouldn't be. The heart of radical feminism is to change that. I can't mate in captivity, Gloria Steinem told a Newsweek reporter in 1984. In a 1991 Wall Street Journal piece, Christina Summers quotes legal scholar Catherine McKinnon as saying, "Feminism stresses the indistinguishability of prostitution, marriage, and sexual harassment." To the militant feminist, marriage is prostitution, and the family is at best a failed institution, and at worst a prison or slave quarters. A decade ago, novelist Toni Morrison told Time, "The little nuclear family is a paradigm that doesn't work." In 1994, the Chicago Tribune quoted Judith Stacy, "The belief that marriage couple families are superior is probably the most pervasive prejudice in the Western world." In the Jewish World Review in February 2000, in a piece titled, "Now, Pro-Fatherhood Funding is Unconstitutional," Sheila Cronin was quoted, "Since marriage constitutes slavery for women, it is clear that the women's movement must concentrate on attacking this institution. Freedom for women cannot be won without the abolition of marriage." Now, most American women do not harbor so bitter and hostile a view of marriage and family. If they did, there would be ever fewer children, and the death of the West would be imminent. But millions are influenced by feminist ideology and its equation of marriage with prostitution and slavery. And that ideology has persuaded many to put off marriage and not to have children. If the preservation of peoples of European ancestry and of the Western civilization they have created were up to the feminists, Western man would have no future. Ideas Have Consequences is the title of the late conservative Richard Weaver's famous little book. And the success of feminist ideas has had consequences for our country. They may be seen in the 1,000% increase in the number of unmarried couples living together in the United States, from 523,000 in 1970 to 5.5 million today. The 2000 census also reports that, for the first time in our history, nuclear families account for fewer than 1 in 4 households, while single Americans who live alone are now 26% of all households. Marriage is out of fashion. Back in 1990, Katarina Runsk, an author far less famous than the American feminists, published in Britain a book called Empty Hearts and Empty Homes, in which she addressed the inevitable result of all this anti-male, anti-marriage rhetoric. Feminism, she said, is a Darwinian blind alley. In biological terms, there is nothing that identifies a maladaptive pattern so quickly as a below-replacement level of reproduction. An immediate consequence of feminism is what appears to be an irreversible decline in the birth rate. Nations pursue feminist policies at their peril. In short, the rise of feminism spells the death of the nation and the end of the West. Oddly, the most politically incorrect of poets, Rudyard Kipling, saw it all coming back in 1919. On the first feminine sandstones, we were promised the fuller life, which started by loving our neighbor and ended by loving his wife, till our women had no more children, and the men lost reason and faith, and the gods of the copybook headings said, "The wages of sin is death." E. The popular culture, in its hierarchy of values, puts the joys of sex far above the happiness of motherhood. The women's magazines, the soaps, romance novels, and primetime TV all celebrate career, sex, and the single woman. Taking care of baby is for grandma. Marriage and monogamy are about as exciting as a mashed potato sandwich. That old triumvirate, the world, the flesh, and the devil, not only has all the best tunes, but all the best ad agencies. How many TV shows today tout motherhood? How long ago did the Brady Bunch go off the air? Paul Anka's signature song, "You're Having My Baby," is now "We're Having Our Baby." But "I Am Woman" is still around. It is a sign of the times that Ozzie and Harriet is not just behind the times. Like Amos and Andy, it has become a metaphor for what was wrong with the times. Any human society, wrote anthropologist J.D. Unwin, is free to choose either to display great energy or to enjoy sexual freedom. The evidence is that it cannot do both for more than one generation. What is now called the Greatest Generation came of age in the Depression and World War II. It displayed great energy and gave America a position of unrivaled preeminence. The baby boomers and Gen Xers, by and large, opted for sexual freedom. Soon we shall see if Unwin was right. The early returns suggest that he was, that the West will not survive its experiment in sexual liberation in recognizable form. As the conservative columnist Jenkin Lloyd-Jones observed, great civilizations and animal standards of behavior coexist only for short periods. F. The collapse of the moral order. What people truly believe about right and wrong can better be determined by how they live their lives than by what they tell the pollsters. If so, the old moral order is dying. As late as the 1950s, divorce was a scandal. Shacking up was how white trash lived. Abortion was an abomination. And homosexuality, the love that dare not speak its name. Today, half of all marriages end in divorce. Relationships are what life is about, and the love that dare not speak its name will not shut up. The collapse of marriage and marital fertility, says Belgian demographer Ron Lestag, is due to a long-term shift in the Western ideational system, away from values affirmed by Christianity, sacrifice, altruism, the sanctity of commitment, and toward a militant, secular individualism focused on the self. When, in 1968, Pope Paul VI issued his encyclical against contraception, Humanae Vitae, the almost universal hostility with which it was received, even among many Catholics, bore witness to the sea change in society. Yet the late Pope was proved prophetic. As Archbishop Charles J. Chaput of Denver writes, in Humanae Vitae, Pope Paul predicted 4 consequences of man's embrace of a contraceptive mindset. 1. Widespread conjugal infidelity and the general lowering of morality. 2. Women would no longer be man's respected and beloved companion, but serve as a mere instrument of selfish enjoyment. 3. It would put a dangerous weapon in the hands of public authorities who take no heed of moral exigencies. 4. The treatment of men and women as objects, and unborn children as a disease to be prevented, would result in the dehumanization of the species. With rampant promiscuity and wholesale divorce, the explosion of pornography, and the mainstreaming of the Playboy philosophy, taxpayer funding of abortion, and a day in America where we can read about teenage girls throwing newborn infants into dumpsters and leaving them out in the snow, the world Paul VI predicted is upon us. Indeed, the new world takes on the aspect of the old world of pagan Rome, when unwanted babies were left on hillsides to die of exposure. Life is no longer respected, as it was by the greatest generation, which came home after seeing how life had been so disrespected in a world at war. As the Pope predicted, the beneficiaries of contraception and abortion have turned out to be selfish men who use women and toss them away like Kleenex. Nowhere is the overthrow of the old moral order more evident than in how homosexuality is seen today and yesterday. In World War II, Under-Secretary of State Sumner Welles, who wore the old-school tie of FDR, was forced out of office for propositioning a sleeping car porter. LBJ feared that the arrest of aide Walter Jenkins, caught in a police sting in a men's room at the YMCA, might cost him millions of votes. Rising GOP star Bob Bauman lost his House seat when caught soliciting teenagers in the Tenderloin district of D.C. That was then. Now is now. The turning point came when Jerry Stutz, who seduced a 16-year-old male page, defied House sanctions and was re-elected in Massachusetts, a Catholic state. Barney Frank easily survived House chastisement for fixing parking tickets for a live-in male lover who was running a full-service whorehouse out of Barney's basement. And in the Clinton era, he began to bring his boyfriend to White House socials. In 2001, John Ashcroft was lacerated during his confirmation hearings by former Senate colleagues for having opposed the nomination of homosexual James Hormel as ambassador to Luxembourg. Hormel, broadcasting the San Francisco Gay Pride Parade, had laughingly welcomed the transvestite Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, who mock the Pope and Catholic nuns. Truly, the world is turned upside down. When America's most public lesbian couple, actresses Anne Heche and Ellen DeGeneres, broke up, the President of the United States called to offer his sympathy. Hillary Clinton became the first First Lady to march in the New York City Gay Pride Parade. Did the New York Times, the good gray lady of 43rd Street, editorially question the wisdom of America's First Lady parading with drag queens and men in thongs? Not at all. As Times national political correspondent Richard Burke told colleagues at the 10th anniversary reception of the National Lesbian and Gay Journalists Association, 3/4 of the people who decide what goes on the front page of the Times are not so closeted homosexuals. Nine months after marching for gay pride, Mrs. Clinton refused to march in the 240th St. Patrick's Day parade, once a must for all New York City politicians. The Ancient Order of Hibernians, the fraternal Roman Catholic group that runs the parade, does not permit the Irish Lesbian and Gay Organization to march as a unit. And Mrs. Clinton had been chastised by gay rights groups for marching on St. Patrick's Day in 2000. That Senator Clinton would appease the homosexuals, even if it meant affronting Irish Catholics, testifies to the new balance of power in the Democratic Party and the new correlation of forces in the culture war. Were she a real rather than a fictional character, Hawthorne's Hester Prynne, instead of being up on that scaffolding having a scarlet A pinned to her blouse, would be on Rosie, exposing Dimsdale as a deadbeat dad and telling a cheering audience what Dr. Laura could do with her advice. Even the children of Middle America now do tours of duty in the sexual revolution. Do your own thing is now a moral norm. Every American woman of childbearing age has had abortion as a fallback, and millions will not give it up. They want it there for themselves and their daughters, and will vote against any politician or party that threatens to take it away. Euthanasia has come to Europe and is coming to America. Upon what moral ground do we any longer stand to stop it? Dr. Kevorkian, a ghoul in an earlier age, some of whose victims were just depressed, not dying, gets a sympathetic profile on 60 Minutes. In the age of the individual, people believe in this life, not the next. In the quality of life, not the sanctity of life. And no one wants to be told how he should live his life. Americans are not going to lead 21st century lives based on 18th and 19th century moral ideals, writes sociologist and public intellectual Alan Wolfe. Any form of higher authority has to tailor its demands to the needs of real people. After a millennium and a half, paganism is the comeback kid. The America many of us grew up in is gone. The Cultural Revolution has triumphed in the minds of millions and is beyond the power of politicians to overturn, even had they the courage to try. Half a nation has converted. The party of working-class Catholics is almost 100% pro-choice and pro-gay rights. The party of the moral majority and Christian coalition has thrown in the towel on the social issues to go out and do the Lord's work growing the Department of Education. Young people are not concerned about their souls. They're worried about the NASDAQ. Most of the intellectual and media elite are fighting allies of the revolution, or fellow travelers. And many conservatives are trolling for the terms of armistice. What a tiny band of secular humanists declared in a manifesto in 1973 has become the moral compass of America and is becoming the law of the land. Americans have listened, absorbed, and embraced the values of a revolution that scandalized their parents and grandparents, calling to mind the insight of Alexander Pope. Vice is a monster of so frightful mien, as to be hated needs but to be seen. Yet seen too oft, familiar with her face, we first endure, then pity, then embrace. Only a social counter-revolution or a religious awakening can turn the West around before a falling birth rate closes off the last exit ramp and rings down the curtain on Western man's long-running play. But not a sign of either can be seen on the horizon. What force can resist the siren song of a hedonistic culture that is so alluring and appealing and is promoted by almost all who speak to the young? Hollywood, MTV, the soaps, primetime TV, the hot mags and the hot music, romance novels and bestsellers. How do parents compete when even teachers and preachers are handing out condoms? What is going to convert American women to wanting what their mothers wanted and grandmothers prayed for? A good man, a home in the suburbs, and a passel of kids. Sounds almost quaint. In Caesar and Christ, Book 3 of his Story of Civilization, historian Will Durant argues that biological factors were fundamental to the fall of the Roman Empire. A serious decline of population appears in the West after Hadrian. A law of Septimius Severus speaks of a penuria hominum, a shortage of men. In Greece, the depopulation had been going on for centuries. In Alexandria, which had boasted of its numbers, Bishop Dionysius calculated that the population had in his time, 250 AD, been halved. He mourned to see the human race diminishing and constantly wasting away. Only the barbarians and Orientals were increasing, outside the empire and within. How did Rome reduce its population? Though branded as a crime, infanticide flourished. Sexual excesses may have reduced human fertility. The avoidance or deferment of marriage had a like effect. Adds Durant, perhaps the operation of contraception, abortion, and infanticide had a dysgenic as well as a numerical effect. The ablest men married latest, bred least, and died soonest. Christians were having children, the pagans were not. Abortion and infanticide, which were decimating pagan society, were forbidden to Christians as the equivalents to murder. In many instances, Christians rescued exposed infants, baptized them, and brought them up with the aid of the community fund. Irony of ironies. Today, an aging, dying Christian West is pressing the Third World and the Islamic world to accept contraception, abortion, and sterilization as the West has done. But why should they enter a suicide pact with us? when they stand to inherit the earth when we are gone. When surrender of his forces was demanded at Waterloo, General Cambronne replied, "The old guard dies, but it does not surrender." A splendid motto for those holed up in our own corregidor of the culture war. Yet a cold appraisal of the battlefield. Who has the big guns? Who holds the high ground? Suggests that the old guard is going to die. For the decisions women are making today will determine if Western nations will even be around in a century. And Western women are voting no. But where did this revolution come from that so swiftly captured so vast a slice of the most Christianized and churched people of the West? And what are its dogmas and doctrines?